officially dissolved. Like Muhammad Ali, Mahmud felt he could not implement major changes without reducing the political power of the religious elite. He visualized restructuring the bureaucracy and the educational and legal systems, where ulama power was strongest. Before such strong measures could be undertaken, however, Ibrahim attacked from Syria in 1839. Battlefield defeat, the decision of the rebuilt Ottoman navy to switch sides and support Egypt, and the Devil of Mahmud, all in the same year, left the empire completely dependent on the European powers for survival. The Tanzimat, reconstructing reforms for the 19th century Ottoman rulers, intended to move civil law away from the control of religious elites and make the military and bureaucracy more efficient. Mahmud's reforming ideas received their widest expression in the Tanzimat, or reorganization, a series of reforms announced by his 16-year-old son and successor, Abdul Majid, in 1839 and strongly endorsed by the European ambassadors. One proclamation called for public trials and equal protection under the law for all, whether Muslim, Christian, or Jew. It also guaranteed some rights of privacy, equalized of eligibility of men for conscription into the army, a practice copied from Egypt, and provided for a new formalized method of tax collection that legally ended tax farming in the Ottoman Empire. It took many years and strenuous efforts by reforming bureaucrats, known as the Men of the Tanzimat, to give substance to these reforms. Over time, one legal code after another, commercial, criminal, civil procedure, was introduced to take the place of the corresponding areas of religious legal jurisdiction. All the codes were modeled closely on those of Europe. The Sharia, or Islamic law, gradually became restricted to matters of family law such as marriage and inheritance. As the Sharia was displaced, job opportunities for the ulama shrank. European observers praised the reforms for the noble principles and rejection of the religious influence. Ottoman citizens were more divided. The Christians and Jews, for whom the Europeans showed the greatest concern, were generally more enthusiastic than the Muslims. Many historians see the Tanzimat as the dawn of modern thought and enlightened government in the Middle East. Others point out that removing the religious elite from influence in government also removed the one remaining check on authoritarian rule. Military reforms. Like Muhammad Ali, Sultan Mahmud sent military cadets to France and the German states for training. In the 1830s, an Ottoman Imperial School of Military Sciences, later to become Istanbul University, was established. Instructors from Western Europe taught chemistry, engineering, mathematics, and physics in addition to military history. Military education became the model for more general educational reforms. In 1838, the first medical school was established to train army doctors and surgeons. Later, a national system of preparatory schools was created to feed graduates into the military schools. The subjects that were taught and many of the teachers were foreign, raising the issue of whether Turkish should be a language of instruction, because it was easier to import and use foreign textbooks than to write new ones in Turkish. French became the preferred language in all advanced professional and scientific training. In numerical terms, however, the great majority of students still learned to read and write in Quran schools down to the 20th century. In the capital of Istanbul, the reform stimulated the growth of a small but cosmopolitan milieu, embracing a European language and culture. The first Turkish newspaper, a government gazette, modeled on that of Muhammad Ali, appeared in 1831. Other newspapers followed, many written in French. Travel to Europe, particularly to England and France, became popular among wealthy Turks. Interest in importing European military, industrial, and communications technology remained strong through the 1800s. Changes in military practice had unforeseen cultural and social effects. The introduction of the fez. Accepting the European notion that modern weapons and drill required modern military dress, beards were deemed unhygienic and, in artillery units, a fire hazard. Military headgear also became controversial. European military caps, which had leather bills on the front to protect against the glare of the sun, were not acceptable because they interfered with Muslim soldiers touching their foreheads to the ground in prayer. The compromise was the brimless cap, now called the fez, which was adopted in the military and then by Ottoman civil officials in the early years of Mahmud's II's reign. The empire's new orientation spread beyond the military. Government ministries that normally recruited from traditional bureaucratic families and relied on on-the-job training were gradually transformed into formal civil services, hiring men educated in the new schools among self-consciously progressive men, particularly those in government service. European dress became the fashion in the Ottoman cities of the later 1800s, while traditional dress became a symbol of the religious, the rural, and the parochial. Legal reforms. Secularization of the legal code particularly affected non-Muslim Ottoman subjects. Islamic law had required non-Muslims to pay a special head tax that was sometimes explained as a substitute for military service. Under the Tanzimat, the tax was abolished and non-Muslims became liable for military service, unless they bought their way out by paying a new military exemption tax. The new law codes gave all male subjects equal access to the civil courts, while the operations of the Islamic law courts shrank. What enhanced the status of non-Muslims most, however, was the strong concern for their welfare consistently expressed by the European powers. The Ottoman Empire became a rich field of operation for Christian missionaries and European supporters of Jewish community life in the Muslim world. Status of woman. The public rights and political participation granted during the Tanzimat applied specifically to men. Private life, including everything connected to marriage and divorce, remained within the sphere of religious law, and at no time was there a question of political participation or reformed education for women. Indeed, the reforms may have decreased the influence of women. The political changes ran parallel to economic changes that also narrowed women's opportunities. After silver from the Americas began to flood the empire in the 1600s, workers were increasingly paid in cash rather than in goods, and business associated with banking and finance developed. But women were barred from the early industrial labor and the professions, and traditional women's work, such as weaving, was increasingly mechanized and done by men. Nevertheless, in the early 1800s, women retained considerable power in the management and disposal of their own property, gained mostly through fixed shares of inheritance. After marriage, a woman was often pressured to convert her land holdings to cash in order to transfer her personal wealth to her husband's family, with whom she and her husband would reside. However, this was not a requirement, since men were legally obligated to support their families single-handedly. Until the 1820s, many wealthy women retained their say in the distribution of property through the creation of charitable trusts from their sons, because these trusts were set up in the religious courts. They could be designed to conform to the wishes of the family members. Then, in the 1820s and 1830s, the secularizing reforms of Mahmud II, which did not always produce happy results, transferred jurisdiction over the trusts from religious courts to the state and ended women's control over his form of property. The Crimean War and its aftermath. Since the reign of Peter the Great, ruling 1689 through 1725, the Russian Empire had been attempting to expand southward at the Ottomans' expense. See the section on Russia and Asia. By 1815, Russia had pried the Georgian region of the Caucasus away from the Ottomans, and the threat of Russian intervention had prevented the Ottomans from crushing Serbian independence. When Muhammad Ali's Egyptian army invaded Syria in 1833, Russia signed a treaty in support of the Ottomans. In return, the Sultan recognized Russia's claim to being the protector of all of the empire's Orthodox subjects. This set the stage for an obscure dispute that resulted in war. The Eastern Question. Bowing to British and French pressure, the Sultan named France protector of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem in 1852. Russia protested, but the Sultan held firm. So Russia invaded Ottoman territories in what is today Romania, and Britain and France went to war as allies of the Sultan. The real causes of the war went beyond church quarrels in Jerusalem and involved diplomatic maneuvering among European powers over whether the Ottoman Empire should continue to exist, and, if not, who should take over this territory. The Eastern Question was the simple name given to this complex issue. Three of the powers, including Russia, had agreed to save the empire in 1839. Britain subsequently became suspicious of Russian ambitions. Prominent anti-Russian politicians in Britain feared that Russia would threaten the British hold on India. Siege of Sevastopol. Crimean War. Conflict between the Russian and Ottoman empires fought primarily in the Crimean Peninsula. To prevent Russian expansion, Britain and France sent troops to support the Ottomans. Between 1853 and 1856, the Crimean War raged in Romania, on the Black Sea, and on the Crimean Peninsula. Britain, France, and the Italian Kingdom of Sardinia-Piedmont sided with the Ottomans. Austria mediated the outcome. Britain and France trapped the Russian fleet in the Black Sea, where its commanders decided to sink the ships to protect the approaches of Sevastopol, their main base in Crimea. However, an army largely made up of British and French troops landed and laid siege to the city. Official corruption and lack of railways hampered the Russians' attempt to supply their forces. On the Romanian front, the Ottomans resisted effectively. At Sevastopol, the Russians were outmatched militarily and suffered badly from disease. Tsar Nicholas died as defeat loomed, leaving his successor, Alexander II, ruling 1855 to 1881, to sue for peace when Sevastopol finally fell 3 months later. The Crimean War brought significant changes to all of the combatants. The Tsar and his government, already beset by demands of the reform of serfdom, education, and the military, discussed later, were further discredited. In Britain and France, the conflict was accompanied by massive propaganda campaigns. For the first time, newspapers effectively mobilized public support for a war. British press accounts so glamorized British participation that the false impression had lingered that Ottoman troops played a negligible role in the conflict. At the time, however, British and French commanders noted the massive losses among Turkish troops in particular. The French press, dominant in Istanbul, promoted a sense of unity between Turkish and French society that continued to influence many aspects of Turkish urban culture. The larger significance of the Crimean War was that it marked the transition from traditional to modern warfare. See Environment and Technology, the Web of Warfare.